Now for today, we have our lecturer is Professor Barney Rubel. Now Barney is a retired Navy captain. He's currently the Dean of the Center for Naval Warfare Studies. He had a 30-year Navy he's a 30-year Navy veteran, and he flew light attack naval aircraft, specifically the A-7 Corsair, and then went on to fly the F-18 Hornet. He commanded Strike Fighter Squadron 131. He's also a graduate of the Spanish Naval War College and the Naval War College here in Newport. He has earned a master's degree from both Salve Regina University and here at the Naval War College. He has published on a variety of subjects, including Navy strategy, security engagement, joint operational art, and advanced wargaming and air warfare. Please join me in welcoming our Dean, Dean Rubel.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. Notice in the introduction, Russ didn't mention distinguished graduate. Straight 89 kind of guy. So there's hope for all you guys in the middle. I have today the very distinct honor and privilege of delivering the Naval Heritage Lecture for this quarter. As Russ said, today's a great day for this lecture because it's on this day in 1911 that a guy named Eugene Ely landed a Curtiss pusher on a jury-rigged deck of the armored cruiser USS Pennsylvania in San Francisco Bay, the first time a U.S. Navy plane landed on a ship. And you can see the picture of the event right here. I was an LSO, and I'm right down there in the side of the deck. Well, naval aviation has come a long way since that day, an epic story in just so many ways. And of course, it's been a story of success and peace as well as war. It's therefore with great pride that I stand before you to tell you a bit of that story and to represent my naval aviation brothers and sisters. Let me first give another admin announcement. The museum reports to me, and the 100 Years of Naval Aviation exhibit over in the museum is now open, and so I encourage you to stop by and take a look at what they've done. As some of you may know, the Naval Institute recently published a book entitled 100 Years of U.S. Navy Airpower, conceived of and edited by Dr. Doug Smith, who's sitting right down here, another one of our faculty and another retired aviator. Doug has really done us all a service by cajoling and pep-talking myself and the other chapter authors into doing this to take another look at the history of naval aviation, and I want to publicly thank him for doing so. Without his encouragement and persistence, the book would not have been written, nor would this lecture be taking place today. Doug asked me to write a chapter on the Navy's transition from propeller-driven aircraft to jets. As I started doing the research for the chapter, I began learning things that cast a new light on what I thought I knew about the history of naval aviation. In fact, it gave me a whole new perspective on my profession, the one I had followed for 30 years. What you will hear today is not like anything you may have previously heard about naval aviation. Fair warning. It's not revisionist history. It's simply a new set of eyes on the data. This is the reason history doesn't get old. It's a continuous process of reinterpreting the data, much as modern historians such as Dion Lundstrom have done. However, I must admit up front, I do not qualify as even an amateur historian. I'm simply a retired aviator that did a writing assignment. So first, let me ask all the naval aviators in the audience to put up their hands. Okay, I'm just trying to figure out how many people in the audience can separate the lies from the facts in my sea stories here. How many LSOs? Yeah, okay, a few. Good. Paddles, brethren. Well, my intent today is not to recite a bunch of facts or read my chapter aloud. Rather, what I'm going to do is try to give you as deep an understanding as I can of naval aviation based in what I found in my research and, of course, what I experienced in the course of a 30-year career. All right, so let's see here. Yep, it works. Here's something the Navy did to celebrate 50 years of naval aviation. I flew off those bottom two carriers, Saratoga in the middle. I flew off of in 1969 over in the Med. She's now moored out here, of course. In India, I got a lot of traps on, and I have over 100 traps on the 27 Charlie class carriers, Intrepid, you see up there. This is what I intend to do today. I guess I'll try to weave in some sea stories to illustrate points, but mainly I want to provide a deeper understanding of how naval aviation responded to changing technology over the years, because I think that's what's going to give you the deepest insight into the organization as a whole, and I think it follows the more truly the intent of the Heritage Lecture Series. And then, of course, the bottom one is to honor the men and women of naval aviation who gave their lives to make this work. I personally lost over 20 friends in the process, and I'm going to cite some numbers to you later that might make you think. Here's some themes, from S&P and all your lectures here. I like themes, so these are the ones I'm going to emphasize as I go through, and we'll see how it works out. All right, so corporate culture, let's talk about that first. The most important thing about naval aviation is its people, not the airplanes and not the ships. In order to understand the people, you got to understand the organizational culture. So let me start with my first sea story. On 15 May 1973, I was ready to fly the A-7 Corsair for the first time. At that time, there weren't any two-seaters, so the first hop was solo. But they had prepared me well with ground school and simulators, so I was more excited than apprehensive as I, with my chase pilot, Bubba Brodsky, taxied out to runway 27 at Cecil Field Naval Air Station. At the runway threshold, the tower told us to hold short because there was another A-7 on final. This one piloted by a classmate of mine, Donnie Sanders. Donnie was on his first flight too. The A-7 did a touch and go in front of us, and then it started to turn downwind for another landing. Just then it fell out of the sky, disappearing into the pine forest that lined the runways. I saw a column of smoke rise, but there was no parachute to be seen. The trash trucks rolled and the rescue helo darted across the runway. I hesitated a moment, and then I called the tower for takeoff. Bubba then came up on the radio and said, no, we're going to taxi back in. Now, I was certainly stupid to call for takeoff right just after an A-7 had crashed right in front of me, but I was also by that time programmed. Imbued with tales of World War II aviators from my reading and from the sea stories of my instructors who were Vietnam veterans, I had absorbed the ethic that you went ahead with the mission regardless of whether the plane next to you blew up. I was in the grip of a very powerful corporate culture. It is that corporate culture that must be understood before you can make sense of the numbers that I'm going to present to you a little later. On the title page of my chapter in the Centennial History, I put a saying that I had heard batted around since my first days in flight school. What's the definition of an optimist? A naval aviator with a savings account. It smacks of gallows humor, implying that naval aviators don't have much in the way of life expectancy, and you'll see at certain times they didn't. So, let's look at how the culture formed. This is a graph, in a way, of the formation of naval aviation culture. This slide depicts the rate of fatalities due to naval aviation mishaps from 1922 to 2008. The shape of the chart shows us how the culture was formed. In the early days, right here, look at the numbers here. 50 fatalities per 100,000 flight hours. That's fatalities. There weren't many airplanes. They didn't fly all that many hours, but the rate was horrendous. And this was the crucible in which the culture of naval aviation was founded. Now you proceed, we gradually got safer as we learned, the airplanes got better, but then here's World War II. All right? Now, the accident rate seems lower, but remember the huge number of sorties and hours being flown. So there's the absolute number of people dying in mishaps. I'm going to give you some numbers later, is horrendous. Here's the Korean War. Here's Vietnam. Here's a bump in around 78 that I don't understand. But each of these reinforced the corporate culture of do what it takes, rather die than look bad, and more subtly maybe, there's no tomorrow. Let's review some other numbers here. Between 1947, when the Navy got its first operational jets, and roughly today, naval aviation lost roughly, actually a little more than 13,000 aircraft to mishaps. Combat losses are always much smaller. and about 9,000 aviators were killed in accidents. Now, this is both Navy and Marine Corps, and it includes all types of aircraft, but by far the worst losses were suffered among the carrier squadrons. In 1954 alone, we lost 776 aircraft and killed 535 aviators. Savings account indeed. Actually, losses prior to 1947 in the formative years of naval aviation, as you can see, were about as bad. Add in the losses from the Pacific War, and you have an organization composed of people who had every expectation of dying young. The culture that grew up in that environment was one of no tomorrow. All right. What do you do if you don't think you're going to live long enough to spend your savings account? Anybody? You party. And party we did. We weren't just doing polite chit-chat over cocktails, but knock-down, drag-out partying. Carrier aviators led the way on this. I tell people that the only two accurate scenes in the movie Top Gun were the bar scene and the scene where Goose got killed by hitting his canopy on an ejection. Those scenes go together. The only folks that outdid us tailhookers in out-of-control partying were the patrol guys. Been there, done that too with them. I think that they wanted to be seen as a legit part of naval aviation, and one way they could was to outdo the tailhookers in partying. There were other ingredients to the culture absorbed from our surface forebears. Principal among these was rugged individualism, thinking for yourself. Some famous admiral, I think it was Arleigh Burke, said, "Any damn fool can follow orders." Naval aviators are taught to think for themselves, and this is a wonderful part of our culture, but it had an effect on the way naval aviation responded to the challenges of new technology in the years from 1947 on. Another ingredient was tribalism. Because of the intensity of the naval aviation experience, strong bonds formed within squadrons, but also among aviators who shared the experience of flying the same kind of aircraft. Essentially, tribes formed. The thing about tribes is they are exclusionary. They glorify their own people and their own internal values. Outside influence is deflected. I was a member of the East Coast Light Attack Tribe. These and other ingredients constituted a very powerful aviation culture. Like any warrior culture, it fortified its members to take risks and endure the stress of no tomorrow. Another saying that we absorb quickly and that illustrates the matter is rather die than look bad. One thing about cultures like this is that they are resistant to change. Naval aviation culture that was formed in the 1920s and 30s was annealed and hardened in the crucible of World War II. By 1945, it was a victorious culture, which further set the glue. Finally, we've got the struggle against the Air Force. From the beginning, the Army Air Corps attempted to gain control of everything with wings, believing that the best way to use the air weapon is through centralized control. Naval aviation was able to fend off the various assaults by land-based airmen, but there were costs. Even today, the tug-of-war continues, with the highly touted Air-Sea Battle Project being, according to the reports I get, more of an exercise in the two services protecting what they see as their equities than it is a creative effort to generate synergies. This struggle also affected the way naval aviation reacted to new technology over the years. Excuse me. So from 1911 to 1991, a span of 80 years, organizational culture was the great constant. And what happened in those years cannot be fully understood without knowing about this culture. Keep this in the back of your minds as I proceed to talk about what happened. So here's what I call Naval Aviation 1.0. I've divided naval aviation to 4 eras, which I've labeled 1.0 through 4.0, kind of to use a software metaphor. I think it's apt because there were important differences in the way the institution of naval aviation dealt with new technology. Naval Aviation 1.0 was essentially 30 years of experimentation and development. Initially, naval aviation struggled for existence, but World War I caused a massive expansion from less than 50 aircraft to almost 3,000, but more importantly, created a powerful advocate in the person of Admiral William Sims. Sims was essentially the founder of the so-called gun club of big gun specialists within the Navy. But as commander of U.S. naval forces in Europe during the war, he became enthusiastic about aviation. He returned to be president of the Naval War College and directed that war games be conducted on how aviation might affect naval warfare. From these games, it became evident that aircraft carriers would become the capital ships of the future. Captain Joseph Reeves, another battleship officer who turned to aviation late in his career, was head of the college's tactics department, now called the wargaming department, and was eventually ordered to become commander of aviation squadrons out in San Diego. Eventually, he became commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet. Other surface officers, including William Halsey and Ernest King, became aviation observers as captains. Along with strong congressional interest, naval aviation enjoyed considerable support during these developmental years, a story that is in marked contrast to the popular image of it being held down by hidebound battleship admirals. There was some opposition, to be sure, but Pearl Harbor didn't turn the Navy on its head as is commonly thought. All the basic intellectual work had been done, and the institutional infrastructure was in place to support the explosive expansion of naval aviation that occurred in 1942 through 1945. This may be a good time to point out something that most of you have probably learned in your time here. The Navy is allergic to doctrine. I will bring out this point again later, but to the extent that the Navy ever had doctrine, it was developed from the war games and fleet exercises that took place during this era. For naval aviation, the centerpiece doctrinal tenet was that in a major fleet battle, the proper initial target was the enemy's aircraft carriers, not his battleships. The judgment was that the dive bombers and torpedo planes would always get through the defenses, so he who struck the enemy's carriers first would win. This slide summarizes the key characteristics of naval aviation during its formative period. The Navy in general was far more open-minded than popular history has depicted, and the Naval War College had an important role in the development of theory, doctrine, and even tactics. As I said, aviation was a subspecialty, and this allowed senior officers to become part of the enterprise, thus avoiding drawing of hard organizational boundaries. Finally, the Navy of the 1920s and 30s was not hard-pressed by day-to-day operational requirements overseas. The fleet could focus on experimentation, and our system of attachés and liaison officers could keep track of foreign developments and incorporate them if needed. Let me spend a little time on the relationship at the time between the War College and naval aviation. With Admiral Sims here as president and Rear Admiral Bill Moffett as the chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, aviation had a powerful pair of champions. As I mentioned, Sims ordered a series of war games here to explore the future role of naval aviation. Reports of these games were fed to Moffett. The games indicated the potential power of aircraft carriers as capital ships, but only if they could generate a sufficient number of sorties rapidly. At the time, the recently commissioned USS Langley was only able to operate about a dozen aircraft because once an aircraft landed, it had to have its wings folded, be lowered into the hangar deck, and the midships elevator raised again before the next aircraft could land. By the time the 12th airplane trapped, the 13th was running out of gas. Admiral Moffett, the guy in the front in the lower picture, decided to order Captain Joe Reeves, the guy in the back with the beard, out to San Diego to command the aircraft squadrons with instructions to find a way to increase sortie generation capability from Langley. Within 6 months, they came up with this idea of a midships barrier, some raised wires that stretched across the deck midship. So if a hook broke or an airplane missed the wires, its landing gear would get entangled in the barrier and it'd pop up, but it would stop. If it trapped, they just lower the barrier and taxi it forward and raise it again and had the deck park forward. Then the next airplane could land. So they could land at an interval of like a minute or so. So Langley went from having only be able to operate about a dozen aircraft, as you see on the left, to operating 48 aircraft, as you see on the right. The rest, as they say, is history. Here you see the classes of pre-World War II carriers. The success of USS Lexington, which is in the upper left, and her sister ship Saratoga in fleet battle experiments really solidified Navy appreciation for the potential of aircraft carriers. USS Ranger in the upper right was found to be just too small to be useful. On the lower right, USS Wasp was a scaled-down version of the Yorktown-class carrier, which is on the lower left. The Yorktowns, and she was scaled down because of treaty limitations. The U.S. only had a few X number of tons left over to build to. Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet were the last three pre-war class carriers. And you can see they bear a strong resemblance to the subsequent Essex class carrier, which was really built in numbers during the war and was essentially a modification of that class. Perhaps the most, So we come to Naval Aviation 2.0, which is World War II. Innovation certainly was not put on hold, or all the aircraft and ships that formed Naval Aviation 2.0 were on the drawing board before the war broke out. Naval Aviation 2.0 was the apotheosis of Naval Aviation 1.0. The potential of naval aviation was realized. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this period of naval aviation because its glorious history is well documented, and new books that have recently come out, as well as some that are about to, will shed a pretty clear light on it. During the war, innovation certainly was not put on hold. There was a lot of problem solving and technical innovation in stride during the war, including airborne radar and improved tactics. Perhaps the most important result of this period was the consolidation of naval aviation into a semi-autonomous community within the Navy. There was little opportunity during the war for aviators to cycle back and forth between aviation and surface assignments. And the centrality of the fast carriers in the Pacific and the carrier-centric hunter-killer groups in the Atlantic propelled aviators into ascendancy within the Navy. As a result, the professional notion of a single unified Navy eroded. One symptom of this was that not long after the end of World War II, the General Line School out at Monterey, California, where lieutenants went to learn how all the elements of the fleet work together, kind of like the captain's schools in the Army and the Air Force do now. It was converted into the Naval Postgraduate School, a specialized technical school. And then there was the creation of legends. There's nothing like heroes to provide the nucleus around which ethics and values can condense, just as water vapor condenses around a piece of dust to form a raindrop. Guys like Butch O'Hare, Wade McCluskey, Jimmy Thatch, and Jimmy Flatley each had exploits that powered some aspect of the naval aviation corporate ethic. Of course, the increased accident losses associated with the explosive growth, coupled with combat losses, only reinforced the cultural atmosphere of No Tomorrow. To give you a feel for the disparity between combat and mishap losses, over the course of the war, the Navy and the Marine Corps lost about 3,800 aircraft to direct combat mishaps or mishaps directly associated with combat. Between 1942 and 1945, they lost 13,000 aircraft to mishaps not associated with combat. Again, the vast majority being among the carrier groups. This is the period of naval aviation in which I served and which I examined in my book chapter. It has to be considered a period of development where naval aviation was struggling to find a defendable basis for its existence and also to accommodate technology that kept changing its strategic and operational environment. It did this, however, with the cultural baggage it had acquired over the previous 3.5 decades. Naval aviation ended World War II at the top of its game, but it had no opportunity to rest on its laurels. The use of the atomic bomb on Japan appeared to usher in a new era of warfare, one in which the relevance of naval aviation, or the Navy itself for that matter, was in question. The newly formed U.S. Air Force was developing a massive bomber called the B-36. The new atomic bombs were too large and heavy to be carried by existing carrier aircraft, and the Soviets were developing jet bombers that could drop such bombs on the fleet. What was needed was a carrier bomber that was big enough to carry these bombs and fast enough to penetrate Soviet defenses. It also needed a high-speed interceptor to shoot down Soviet bombers before they got too close to the fleet. The answer the Navy came up with is shown in the middle, USS United States, a carrier much larger than even the late war Midway class. Its air wing is shown, and this is a 1947 photograph. Consists of swept-wing jet bombers and tailless jet interceptors, that came to be known as the Cutlass, on an axial or straight deck. In 1949, Secretary of Defense Johnson, a partisan supporter of the Air Force and its B-36 intercontinental bomber, canceled construction of the United States. This precipitated what is now called the Revolt of the Admirals, in which the CNO, SINCPAC, and a couple other flags testified in Congress against SecDef orders about the need for a Navy nuclear delivery capability and on the deficiencies of the B-36. This resulted in the CNO being fired, but also in Congress buying into the need for a naval component to the nation's nuclear deterrent, eventually authorizing USS Forrestal, the first of the supercarriers. Forrestal was not commissioned until 1955. In the meantime, the Navy needed to constitute a viable nuclear deterrent in order to maintain credibility of its argument. This slide depicts some early approaches to a solution. The aircraft in the upper left is the P-2V Neptune, a large twin-engine land-based patrol plane that had just been fielded after the war. Some experiments were run on using JATO bottles and a deck run to launch it from a Midway-class carriers. The planes would not recover back aboard but would return to a land base or ditch at sea. You can see what a dicey proposition it would have been. This concept was actually put into operation for about a year. The Neptunes would be staged forward at a base in North Africa, and then if the bubble went up, the carrier would pull into port, the Neptunes would be craned aboard, and then the carrier would leave. It only lasted for about a year. The bottom airplane on the upper left is the AJ-1 Savage. This airplane was a hybrid, 2 piston engines on the wings and a jet engine in the tail. It was just large enough to carry the Mark IV nuclear weapon, but just small enough to fit on the elevators of an Essex-class carrier. The Savage was a complex airplane for the day with a theoretical all-weather day and night attack capability. Given the pressures of the day, it was rushed into production and turned out to be a bit of a death trap for its crews. However, it did provide the initial nuclear deterrent bomber the Navy so desperately needed. The Navy kept working on successive generations of large nuclear bombers, the key early example being the A-3 Sky Warrior, generally known as the Whale. The Whale didn't have a long career as a nuclear bomber because the technology of nuclear weapons was developing at a fast rate, and by the time Forrestal was commissioned in 1955, the size and the weight of bombs had decreased to the point where they could be carried by most any fighter-sized aircraft. The F-2H Banshee, an early straight-wing 2-engine jet, became the workhorse in this regard until the A-4 Skyhawk came around. The thing about nuclear warfare is that timing is critical. You can't just wait for the sun to rise or the weather to clear. Although the Navy had done some night work in World War II, it was conducted on a relatively small-scale basis as a specialty. The same approach was taken in the late 40s and 50s with what were called composite squadrons established on the east and west coasts. These squadrons sent out 4 or 6 plane detachments on deploying carriers. Excuse me. The technology of all-weather and night nuclear delivery operations was in its infancy, making it challenging in any case. However, compounding the problem was that the Navy had not developed its training process to accommodate it. As of the early 50s, there was no jet pipeline in naval aviation training. Newly winged pilots flew piston engines up to getting their wings. Newly winged pilots were sent to these composite squadrons and immediately had to transition to jets, night, and all-weather nuclear delivery flying. I'm going to read you a passage from a guy named Captain Jerry O'Rourke, the aviator at the time, in his memoirs, give you a feel for the environment of the time. He says, "All naval aviators are routinely exposed to or involved in aircraft accidents. That's almost accepted as a hazard of the trade. In carrier work where dangers abound, accidents tend to be more frequent. In the night carrier operations of those days, accidents were so frequent that they were considered commonplace and unexceptional. Whenever a departed, the aircraft they flew off were more or less written off. No one expected that all of them would ever come back to Atlantic City. Unfortunately, the same negativism tended to extend to the pilots as well, whose safe return wasn't much better than the aircraft. Between pilots lost, the pilots maimed, and the pilots who decided to throw in their wings, precious few deaths ever returned with the same resources they took with them." This slide provides insight into the problem. The white bars show the number of aircraft destroyed, while the orange ones show the number of aircrew killed. Remember, this shows Navy and Marine Corps totals for all types of aircraft, but again, the bulk of it is Navy tactical aircraft embarked on carriers. In one sense, this slide shows success over time in reducing the number of accidents. On the other hand, if you look at the vertical axis, you see the awful scale of the losses. This is what shocked me when I first started doing research for the chapter on the Navy's transition to jets. Naval aviation was trying to adopt the new jet technology while clinging to a corporate culture that was formed around the technology of piston engine propeller aircraft. Here you can see a comparison of Navy accident rates versus those of the Air Force. This tells a tale of how organizations adapt. In 1951, both services were experiencing catastrophic accident rates, both as a consequence of expansion during the Korean War and the incorporation of jets. Both services established safety centers to gain control of the problem. The Air Force Safety Center consisted of 525 personnel and immediately went about establishing standardized procedures, centralized accident investigation, and rather coercive policies to enforce discipline. The Navy Safety Center, on the other hand, consisted of 25 people, and accident investigation was left in the hands of squadrons. Procedure standardization did not even start to occur in the Navy until the early 60s, and even then encountered resistance from the embedded and robust culture of rugged individualism. I went back through old Naval Aviation news issues at the time, excuse me, and you can see these articles puling with aviators well, we know that some officers think that standardized procedures would compromise an officer's ability to think for himself, but experience in other areas show that's not true. You can just see it. NATOPS, what is this crap? I know better. You get, Nugget, don't worry about this. I'll show you how to fly. You can see here the cost of corporate culture. In 1960, the naval accident rate was 4 times that of the Air Force. In 1970, triple, and even by 1980, it was still double the accident rate of the Air Force. By 1988, the naval accident rate was equal to the Air Force and has stayed there ever since. This belies the notion that operating off carriers carries some kind of inherent safety cost. Part of this has to do with the aircraft. It is my view, not popularly shared by some, that the F-18 Hornet corrects the key technological defects of earlier jets: unreliable and slow to respond engines, adverse handling characteristics, and difficult man-machine interfaces. Moreover, when I transitioned to the F-18 after 15 years of flying the A-7 and having been away from naval aviation for 2.5 years up here at the college, I was struck by the difference in the organizational atmosphere I encountered. By 1988, the Hornet community was practicing what we now call organizational risk management, a balancing of mission importance and acceptable risk. In the A7 community, some of the old guys can back me up on this, risk acceptance was a matter of how bad the CO, CAG, or Admiral wanted to make all the scheduled sorties and how concerned you were as an individual pilot with keeping from developing a reputation for being a coward. It was this change to corporate culture, I believe, it was with this change that the transition to jets was fully complete. Let me pull the thread a little bit more on the environment the first jet aviators had to face. On the upper right, you see an F-7U Cutlass about to have a ramp strike. The pilot had not dealt correctly with the slow engine response of the early jet engines, nor the novel handling characteristics of a swept-wing jet. The result was a ramp strike in which the lieutenant aviator was killed. You can see the landing signal officer in the red circle sprinting to starboard for dear life. He survived. I actually had a somewhat similar experience myself on about the second time I was up on the LSO platform as a newbie, but we can save that for drinks over a bar. The picture on the lower left shows an F-9, F-3 Panther going into the midships barrier. This was a consequence of missing the arresting wires on a straight deck carrier. The barrier was the thing that made American-style carrier aviation possible, but it turned out not to work so well for jets. If one of the wires rode up over the jet's nose, it would decapitate the pilot, and this Panther boy is about to lose his head. The 3 pictures from the upper left to lower right show the problem of jets trying to operate off straight-deck carriers. The jet engines of the day were slow to spool down as well as to spool up. As a result, if the pilot added power in close to compensate for too much sink rate, he could find himself in the predicament of this Banshee pilot. The power came off too late, and the slick jet just floated over the barrier. This barrier looks almost like a barricade, and into the pack of parked aircraft up front. This was not an isolated occurrence. This particular crash was fatal to the pilot, but he was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for guiding his jet down the middle to avoid most of the sailors and parked aircraft on the sides instead of ejecting. By 1953, things were at a crisis stage for the Navy. Having concentrated on how to operate heavy nuclear bombers from aircraft carriers, it had not focused on making jets safer to fly from aircraft carriers. Fortunately, the U.S. Navy had retained its close working relationship with the Royal Navy after the war. The Royal Navy, whose air arm had been greatly constrained by the Royal Air Force, they were not, for example, in the nuclear delivery business at all, was more focused on convoy protection. Thus, its area of interest was on how to operate the new jet aircraft more effectively from aircraft carriers acting in a convoy protection role. It first experimented with a pneumatic flexible deck in which jets without wheels would land on a rubberized surface supported by big air-filled tubes. They actually did this, didn't work so well. One of their officers came up with the idea of canting the tram line of the landing area about 6 degrees to starboard so that if a jet missed the wires, it would just go to full power and go around for another try. Depicted on the top is HMS Argus with an early angle deck layout. Via the liaison chain, this idea quickly jumped the Atlantic to the U.S. Within 2 years, the USS Antietam was putting to sea with the new deck. It was an immediate success. The hydraulic catapults of World War II were hard to scale up to the capacity needed to handle the big new nuclear bombers, or jets in general for that matter. U.S. Navy engineers were focused on an explosive-powered catapult. But again, Naval Aviation with the Royal Navy produced a demonstration of their steam-powered catapult in the U.S., and once that was demonstrated, it was kind of hard for U.S. engineers to maintain that an explosive catapult was better. Finally, the higher approach speeds of jets and their need for a wider and longer approach turn meant that it was almost impossible for the pilot to see the landing signal officer waving his paddles. Another British invention was the optical landing system that allowed the pilot to see whether he was on glide slope or not from a mile or more out. Let's go back to this slide. If we take another look at the aircraft losses chart, you can see the dramatic reduction in accidents that occurred in the early 50s, and this is mostly due to the angled deck and the mirror landing system, or the optical landing system. Despite these improvements, the loss rate was still about 1 aircraft per day through the late 60s, indication that the Navy still felt pressure to operate at full speed despite the losses. Since we're talking about innovation and adaptation, I ought to mention 3 interesting dead ends in naval aviation during the 1950s and 60s. All 3 were attempts to deal with the difficulties of establishing a nuclear deterrent at sea and incorporating jet engine and swept-wing technology. The Martin Seamaster, the large jet-powered flying boat in the upper left, was an attempt to sidestep the difficulties of operating large jet nuclear bombers from an aircraft carrier. The plane actually showed some good performance initially, but suffered 2 catastrophic accidents in which the crews were killed. The program was eventually canceled before the plane went into production because the development of the Polaris missile-firing ballistic missile sub made it irrelevant. Navy engineers were initially skeptical about operating swept-wing jets off carriers, with some justification in light of the subsequent accident rate. Again, the flying boat solution was pursued, this time in the form of a seagoing version of the Air Force F-102 Delta Dart. Named the Sea Dart, the flying boat fighter used an extendable hydroski for takeoff and landing. Again, it showed some initial promise. It was the only seaplane ever to break the sound barrier. However, 2 catastrophic accidents and the success of swept-wing carrier aircraft like the F-9, F-8 Cougar and the FJ-3 Sea Fury doomed the program. Vertical flight was attractive to the Navy on a number of accounts. Now, the Navy was a distracted organization at this time. I'll make this point a little later. So when I say vertical flight, the Navy was not at all interested in the new helicopter technology that Igor Sikorsky came up with in World War II, and instead relegated its development to the Coast Guard until it actually had developed and they picked up on it. But vertical flight in general was attractive to the Navy on a number of counts. First, if the aircraft had sufficient performance, carriers could be freed of having to tie their operations to the demands of catapults and arresting gear. Second, vertical takeoff fighters could be stationed aboard transports for convoy protection. Jet engines of the 50s and 60s couldn't generate enough thrust for vertical ops, but turboprop seemed to offer potential. Several prototypes, including the Pogo, pictured here, were built, but lack of fighter performance and the difficulties of landing with the pilot literally on his back eventually dampened Navy interest. Of course, the Royal Navy and the U.S. Marines eventually bought the AV-8 Harrier, which, although limited in range and load-carrying capacity, has filled an important niche need for them. I do need to say a few words about the key wars that Naval Aviation 3.0 was involved in. The Korean War caught the U.S. off guard, and the initial going featured a lot of scrambling and in-stride adaptation by all the services. The presence of carrier air was a critical factor in the stabilization of the Pusan perimeter, and later was the principal aviation component in the Incheon invasion and other amphibious operations. Excuse me. The mobile air base the concept of a mobile air base at sea proved its worth. The Navy and Marines heavily used World War II vintage aircraft during the Korean War, but fed in the new jets as they were available. The Navy did not introduce a swept-wing jet into the war, but nonetheless had a positive kill ratio against the Soviet MiG-15. Interestingly, the best MiG exchange ratio was achieved by the F-3D Sky Knight, that ungainly-looking aircraft in the upper left-hand corner, because it was designed as a night fighter. Naval aviation again proved the worth of a mobile airfield at sea in the Vietnam War. Most of the U.S. sorties over North Vietnam were flown by the Navy because the carriers could provide a much wider variety of avenues of approach and lines of operation than could land-based air coming out of the South or Laos. Naval aviation demonstrated an ability to adapt to the unique warfare conditions in Vietnam. It established 2 land-based attack squadrons, Helicopter Light Attack Squadron 3 and Light Attack Squadron 4, to better support Navy riverine operations in the South. These squadrons conducted a heroic effort. Professor Bill Calhoun, many of you probably know, who just retired from NSDM, was one of the HAL-3 pilots. Carrier operations were marred by several near-catastrophic fires started by ordnance mishaps. These tragedies featured considerable heroism by the ship's crews in each case, and their investigation led to numerous improvements in ordnance safety on the flight deck. The other major innovation was the establishment of Navy Fighter Weapons School, or Top Gun, in 1969, on the basis of an analysis of air-to-air engagements with the North Vietnamese. The introduction of radar and infrared air-to-air missiles in the 1950s led many to think that the era of dogfighting was over. On the basis of a thing called the ALT report, the Navy decided that what was needed was a renaissance in air combat maneuvering training. Thus, Top Gun was founded. Finally, the dense missile and anti-aircraft gun environment over Hanoi and other areas of North Vietnam led to many aircraft losses and to prisoners of war. The heroism of these men, of all services, established yet another set of legends that enhanced the warrior culture of naval aviation. Now, I debated whether I was going to read this next story or not. It takes a few minutes, but I think I would, because I want to honor the Vietnam guys. This is from an email that I got, and he says, this is one of the guys that was there. In July 67, Air Wing 16 and Oriskany were back on the line after an October 66 fire killed 46, most of whom were Air Wing pilots. After a brief warm-up on Dixie Station, during which we lost an A-4 off the Cat, we moved to Yankee Station on 14 July. That first day, Cool Hand Cunningham, who was a former Air Force B-47 pilot, lost his A-4 to flak in Route Package 1, but we got him back. In the 13 days between 14 July and 27 July, we lost 12 aircraft, 1 SPAD, 6 A-4s, 4 F-8s, and 1 A-3. Dead or missing were attack pilots Castle, Hartman, and Davis, fighter pilots Hunter and Zhukovsky, plus 2 A-3 crewmen. Rescued from deep in Indian country were F-8 driver Butch Verich and A-4 pilot Larry Duthie. Now let me tell you how it went with Duthie and the F-8 Charlie that saved him. And this guy was an F-8 driver who's writing this. On 18 July 67, I was assigned MIG cap, and I apologize for some of the technical terms here. The fighter guys will know what I'm talking about. I think you'll get the feeling even though I don't define all the terms. On 18 July 67, I was assigned MIG cap for an alpha strike on the Hanoi battery plant. After the cat shot, my F-8 gave me a wing unlocked warning light. Several recyclings didn't change anything, and since my winging was Nordo, I traded John Hellman my MIG cap for his bar cap. I dropped my winging off. You notice he didn't turn around, declare an emergency, and land the airplane, even though he's got a wing unlocked light. I dropped my winging off so he could join the recovery in progress and took station off the northern SAR, Search and Rescue Station. During the strike, Dick Hartman's A4E was hit by flak. He got about 50 kilometers south of Hanoi before ejecting. Other A4s set up a rescue patrol, but they were soon low on fuel. Listening to all this on strike control frequency, I again recycled the wing several times, still the unlocked indication. The A4 ResCap made radio contact with Hartman and reported his tack-end position from Oriskany, but they had to bingo back to the ship. I knew from personal experience with the Verich rescue 2 days earlier that timing was everything. If the rescue couldn't be made in the first hour or two, the unfavorable odds became astronomical. So I asked Red Crown for a steer to Hartman's position and went feet dry. I had witnessed Lee Prost's death off the Oriskany a few months earlier when his wing came off while strafing the spar, so I tried to hold the F-8 speed down to the NATOP's wing unlocked 220 knots. Not possible. Before I got to Hartman's position, I started taking 37 millimeter close aboard, so I pushed it up to 300 knots. When the fan song locked on, that's an SA-2 radar, the APR-27 began warbling. My Crusaders showed me her wing would stay on through 350 knots in a 3G barrel roll. I was still about 20 kilometers south of Hartman's advertised position and down to 1,500 feet trying to shake off the fan song when I stumbled across an emergency beeper. Going over the top in another barrel roll, I spotted a parachute in the trees. It was the first time we realized two A4s were down, both Hartman and his wingee, Larry Duthie. I couldn't get Duthie to answer me on the radio, but his beeper was loud and clear, so I swung down into the trees to pick him up visually. That brought a whole lot of 37 millimeter my way, so not wanting to give Duthie's position away to those guys, I climbed out of there and took up a position to the west. The Jolly Green, which is the rescue helo, and the Sandys had been scrambled when Hartman was reported down, and they were already en route from the southwest. It was then a matter of staying overhead to vector them when they got there. That involved 45 minutes of evading continual flak and an occasional SAM. At one particularly hazardous point, my F-8 kept her wing on at 400 knots and 4.5 Gs before the SAM-2 flew past. Unfortunately, the Jolly Green still had a long way to come when I reached bingo fuel. Oriskany had launched the KA-3 tankers to top off the Alpha strike and was trying to hot spin one to get some fuel back in the air, but all they had airborne was one A-4 buddy tanker to cover the recovery. Rules were that the tanker had to stay around the pattern. God was there that day. I felt his hands on the stick many times. He also inspired a hell of an A-4 driver by the name of Mac Davis to lie about his fuel state and take fuel from the buddy tanker and come on back in to help me. When I heard Mac coming in, I knew we had a great chance to get Duthie if I could show him the position. So I changed my bingo calculations from making a Oriskany to just getting feet wet. Davis made a perfect rendezvous, and I dropped him off over Duthie as the Sandys reported 20 clicks to the southwest. I was down to 500 pounds. This is a Crusader, remember, and didn't really think I would make the water. I was trying to give Red Crown my likely ejection position when Tom Maxwell came up on the frequency. His KA-3 whale detachment had dozens of saves during that cruise, and I got 2 of them in the first 2 weeks on the line. It was against all the rules. Here we go again. It was against all the rules for those guys to go feet dry in the area of known SAM firings, but Tom gave me the same break I had given Duthie and came on in. He swung in front of me with his drogue extended and the APR-27 blaring in our ears. After plug-in, I glanced down at the gauge and saw it rising past the first index mark from 0. When I disconnected with 1,200 pounds, The Jolly Green reported the successful pickup of Duthie. 4 hours later, Oriskany launched the equivalent of an Alpha strike and tried for Hartman. The northern SAR helo got within a couple kilometers before it flew right over a 37mm site with the loss of 7 very brave souls. Crusader drivers like J.P. O'Neill and Pete Peters dodged SAMs in the area all night long to keep radio contact with Hartman. He reported an intensive weapons buildup all around him and suggested a massive strike on the area. The next morning, the second northern SAR helo got shot up before getting more than 10 kilometers feet dry, and Perfume, who I suppose was the controller, called it off. There was talk of trying the Fulton recovery rig, but we lost contact with Hartman the next night and it was all over. Mac Davis was killed 7 days later after he vectored the Jolly Green to Duthie. SecDef was visiting the Oriskany, and we had to show him we could bomb trucks at night, even with a 500-foot overcast. Mac hit the side of a hill in Route Package 1. Between July 67 and January 68, Oriskany lost 37 aircraft and 26 pilots. That's 6 months. Add to that the 33 pilots lost in the fire and the 6 missing in actions from the 66 crews. Compare that with the deck loading of 70 pilots and 60, and that's, by the way, if you add it up, it's 65 aviators killed. 70 pilots and 60 aircraft on a 27 Charlie carrier, and the odds get rather grim. Our CAG, Bert Shepard, did get some recognition on the Ed Sullivan Show as the Navy's then most decorated aviator. And of course, John McCain, who flew all of about 5 or 6 missions before getting bagged, was the star of Discovery's story about VA-163 Saints. The rest of us have just suffered in silence, along with the scores of others, through long, sleepless nights and occasionally trying to type an email with tears fogging our glasses. Now, I've painted thus far a pretty bleak picture of Naval Aviation 3.0, but of course the real story is one of success. The progressive refinement of jet engine and aircraft design and technology led to successive waves of better aircraft, and the design of aircraft carriers kept pace also, with Kitty Hawk class, the Enterprise, and eventually the Nimitz class. Moreover, the refinement of training process with the introduction of fleet replacement squadrons, the gradual acceptance of standard operating procedures, and more sophisticated maintenance resulted in a highly capable naval aviation organization. I should also note that the refinement of aircraft design, coupled with the increasing cost of aircraft, meant that the air wing complement of aircraft stabilized. In the first 15 years of the jet transition era, there were 5 times as many new models introduced as there were in the next 40. Thus, pilots after 1965 were making far fewer switches to a new type of aircraft, and that could only improve the safety record. So let me summarize the characteristics of Naval Aviation 3.0. In the early post-World War II era, naval aviation was a pressured and distracted organization whose focus was on survival. Its focus was on how to turn the carriers into viable nuclear delivery platforms. Fortunately, due to a strong relationship with the Royal Navy, naval aviation was able to absorb 3 critical innovations that led to its success aboard carriers. At the same time, naval aviation became progressively more divorced from the larger Navy, or perhaps better said, developed the notion that it was the Navy and that the other communities were in support. This would lead to disconnects in innovation later on. It is no accident today the CNO has directed his innermost innovation cell, NOOX, to conduct warfighting wholeness assessments. What this tells me is that the Navy still has no institutionalized way to think in terms of combined naval arms. Naval Aviation 3.0 was highly risk tolerant. Not only did it tolerate the cruel costs of mishaps, it would order into production new models of jet aircraft before flight testing was complete. Actually, it would order, to reduce risk, it would order multiple models of aircraft at the same time. So this led to a lot of new designs and a lot of new aircraft being test flown. That was to reduce risk, but it accepted increased risk because it couldn't wait for the development process to take place like today. So an airplane would get its first flight, and the Navy would order it into series production before flight testing was anywhere near complete, because it just had to have airplanes ready to populate the flight decks, the next step in technology, so that it could maintain its the nuclear deterrent and operating carriers or jets from carrier decks. All right, so now we arrive at Naval Aviation 4.0, the version of naval aviation that all of you inhabit today. This is in many ways different from its forebears. Obviously, it's high-tech and getting higher tech. It's also the safest version of naval aviation, with accident rates equal to those of the Air Force for its entire span. An indicator that the transition to jets is indeed complete in the Navy and the Marine Corps. It is a naval aviation that is computerized and networked, and likely to get more so. However, perhaps the biggest change is that it's co-ed. I've devoted a lot of emphasis to naval aviation culture so far in this lecture, and part of the reason is so that you can understand how different your naval aviation is from that which went before. The shift, as most of you probably know, has not been easy or pretty. The tailhook scandal in 1991 was a major catalyst for change. By the way, I was in command of a Hornet squadron at that time, and as far as I know, I was the only CO in the Navy that forbade his pilots to go to tailhook 91. It wasn't that I knew anything like the gauntlet would happen. I just felt that my pilots, most of whom were married, engaged, or going steady, had no business cavorting out in Las Vegas a month before cruise. Saved a lot of paperwork, I can tell you. To better understand the nature of naval aviation culture on the eve of tailhook 91, let me share with you another sea story. This is the story of Rosemary Mariner, the Navy's first female jet pilot. She got her wings in props in the mid-'70s and was ordered to a composite squadron in Norfolk. This squadron flew S-2s, C-1s, and A-4s. As a publicity stunt, the CO let her check out in the A-4. Well, guess what? She liked it. So when it came her turn for shore duty, she put in to go to VX-5, the test and eval squadron out at China Lake, to fly the A-7. Well, that meant she was sent down to VA-174 for transition to the A-7, and that's where I was at the time as a landing signal officer. We still only had single-seaters, so we put an LSO on the runway for a student's first 2 hops because the Corsair was a bit difficult to land and stop on a runway. On her first hop, the local TV cameras were out there, and with the LSO, and as you imagine, everything was sweetness and light. I was her LSO on hop number 2, and the cameras weren't there. It turned out she was using the wrong landing technique, and I had quite a time getting her down safely. In the debrief, I treated her just like I treated the male students who flew that way. I unloaded on her. She was a bit shocked because I think she had been handled with kid gloves prior to that, but she took it and got better. All well and good. But when the CO of VX-5 got word that she was coming to his squadron, he sent word to Bupers that no damn woman was going to fly one of his airplanes. Bupers went ahead and changed her orders to the Naval Weapons Center out at China Lake, where she ended up flying test flying F-86 drones for a couple of years. I can't imagine a more dangerous flying assignment. Years later, she and I both screened for command on the same board, she being the first female to screen for aviation command. She was initially slated for VT-7, the Advanced Jet Training Squadron in Meridian, Mississippi. The wing commander up there said that no damn woman would command one of his squadrons. And so Bupers reslated her. Actually, she got a better deal. She got command of VAQ-34 out on the West Coast. That was naval aviation culture on the eve of tailhook 91. I won't recapitulate the pains that naval aviation went through adapting to women, but as far as I can tell, it has done so successfully, and we should all take pride in that. Naval Aviation 4.0 is better than its predecessors. On the other hand, there's still some flies in the ointment. For starters, of course, there's the emerging budget crisis that threatens to chip away at our structure. The so-called strike fighter gap is a symptom of the crossing of curves of aircraft expense and budget restrictions. It is not clear at all that the Navy will be able to continue to operate 11 aircraft carriers. Also worrisome to me is what I perceive as the isolation of naval aviation. For some years now, it has adopted an enterprise paradigm, which has certainly helped it to manage its resources efficiently, but I also think this approach has caused it to lose whatever vestige of a one Navy outlook it previously had. Back in 2006, I led the research and gaming effort to produce a new maritime strategy, which resulted in the publishing of CS21. When I started the project, I reached out in all directions for support and collaboration. I got excellent participation from the Army, Coast Guard, Marines, academia, foreign countries, and industry. Notably absent was the U.S. Air Force and Naval Aviation. A three-star aviator at the time told me in no uncertain terms that Naval Aviation was doing well as an enterprise and he saw no reason why it should risk upsetting its apple cart by participating in a strategy project. I believe that this was a short-sighted attitude, and Naval Aviation will be well served in the future to look for ways to integrate more fully into the Navy as a whole. Here are some reasons that Naval Aviation needs to be more collaborative. The DF-21 missile in the upper left is close to being deployed by China and was specifically designed to put carriers out of action. Its counterpart versions are, by the way, meant to put our land bases in the region out of action. But the DF-21 isn't the only threat. New types of anti-ship cruise missiles are hard to defend against, like the SSN-22 and the SSN-27, and air-independent propulsion subs are devilishly hard to find. Moreover, it's getting harder to get lost out at sea due to satellites, cell phones, over-the-horizon radars, and other technologies. The protective cover of the open ocean is becoming harder to come by. It is my opinion that in an increasing number of situations, carriers will not be able to operate wherever they please. If Naval Aviation goes into institutional denial on this or demands that big money gets thrown at trying to establish defensive bastions around the carriers, it'll suffer. Naval Aviation 4.0 needs to figure out how to become open-minded and experimental like its forebear, Naval Aviation 1.0. We also need to get back to being naval officers first. Now I'd like to take a look. This is after all the War College, and I taught for many years in JMO, so I can't resist a little of this, so indulge me for a minute. I want to look at sea control versus power projection, and I use the word versus advisedly because it seems to me that naval aviation has not, at least since the end of World War II, been able to strike an adequate balance between them. Rather, it adopts an exclusive focus on one to the exclusion of the other, and then rubber bands to the other when the crisis or near disaster forces it to. During Naval Aviation 1.0, the principal focus was gaining sea control, that is, the destruction of an enemy fleet carriers first. Land attack, especially on targets that supported sea control, such as naval bases, was also developed. So there was a balance of sorts. Once World War II started, the early operational focus was on sea control, with 4 carrier battles being fought in 1942. Yes, there was power projection too, the Doolittle strike, etc. As the Central Pacific campaign got underway, the focus started shifting to land attack until by 1945 the bulk of carrier operations were directed against the Japanese homeland. Of course, in the Atlantic, most of the focus was sea control operations against the U-boats. As I've pointed out, in Naval Aviation 3.0, the initial obsession almost was nuclear attack against the Soviets. The Korean and Vietnamese wars further reinforced the landward focus of naval aviation. The dangers of such an exclusive focus were highlighted in October and November of 1973 during the Arab-Israeli War. The Soviet Mediterranean fleet built up to 96 ships, many armed with anti-ship cruise missiles. Moreover, they had a doctrine for using them against U.S. carrier groups. U.S. Naval Aviation, on the other hand, had little or nothing in the way of anti-ship weapons, tactics, or doctrine. I know this because I was there. My first flight in the fleet was on the wing of my skipper, a guy named Dick Mackey, carrying Mark 82 bombs to bird dog Soviet cruisers and destroyers. All we could do was orbit overhead, lit up by their radars, waiting for them to shoot at us. Our job was to get out a call on the radio before we died that World War III had started. It was only after the crisis blew over that we started working on anti-ship tactics and weapons. Heck of a first flight as a nugget, though, let me tell you. For the balance of the Cold War, naval aviation had at least a modicum of balance between sea control and land attack. However, our power projection focus was exclusively on one-time strikes like El Dorado Canyon in Libya. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, We showed up in the Red Sea. I was aboard Eisenhower. We were the first ones through. Ready on arrival, which is really what naval aviation is all about, ready on arrival. This is a good thing. What we did not have was any theory or doctrine of an air campaign against land targets, to include a complete absence of any command and control arrangements at the operational level to control an air campaign. I was on one of the Red Sea carriers in the early going of Desert Shield, and we poo-pooed the ATO. We wanted route packages like in Vietnam. After Desert Storm, Naval Aviation embarked on a multi-year and ultimately futile effort to stuff a JFAC aboard ships somewhere. The early stages of Operation Enduring Freedom demonstrated that naval aviation had matured quite a bit in the business of land attack. However, our focus has been almost exclusively land attack since the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, an emerging Chinese Navy is starting to pose a serious sea control threat in the Far East, and the Iranian Navy has developed new capabilities that challenge the Navy's capability to keep important international trade routes to the Persian Gulf open. We got Halsey, Alpha, and Charlie guys here. Raise your hands. Yeah, some. Kind of know what I'm talking about. Yet naval aviation finds itself with little in the way of new weapons, tactics, or doctrine to fight for sea control. I'd like to shift now to talk a bit about aircraft carriers from an operational art perspective. When I was an instructor in JMO and a game director, one of the first questions I'd get asked by students was, where should we put the carriers? This was the wrong question, because the nature of naval warfare is mobile and attrition-centric. The question is not where to put the carriers, but what role they should be used in. It is their doctrinal role that establishes how much risk they can tolerate and generally how much risk they will actually encounter. Since Admiral Sims began the carrier games here at Newport after World War I, the aircraft carrier has been used in 6 different roles, depicted here on the slide more or less chronologically, at least from the perspective of how they were actually used. When aviation was in its infancy, the performance of aircraft pretty much dictated that their principal use would be in scouting and in observing the fall of battleship shots. In this role, the carriers would be kept back from the battle line and presumably more or less out of harm's way. Once World War II started, the carriers were used in a way much like Nathan Bedford Forrest uses cavalry during the Civil War, making hit-and-run raids that disrupted the enemy. The carriers counted on staying unlocated for their protection, something that was eminently doable in 1942. The Doolittle raid on Tokyo was a prime example of this use. Starting with the Battle of the Coral Sea, the carriers were used as capital ships to destroy an enemy fleet. In this role, they were expendable, so long as they could inflict greater damage on the enemy. After the war, as I have discussed, the carriers became nuclear strike platforms. What they had to do there was survive long enough to launch their strikes. In Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, OEF, and OIF, the carriers became airfields at sea. In other words, they became decisively engaged in supporting a fight ashore. Generally speaking, such a use compromises a carrier's mobility so that it can't tolerate much or any threat. We're so used to seeing the carriers used this way that we have literally forgotten the details of the previous uses. The carriers have also been used as geopolitical chess pieces, being moved around the great playing board of the oceans to send diplomatic signals. Generally, in these situations, the administration wants the carriers to be visible so that the message gets across. So thus, risk tolerance becomes problematic. During the Yom Kippur in '73, the Nixon administration put U.S. carriers in the Eastern Med at great tactical risk in order to checkmate incipient Soviet moves to reinforce and resupply Egypt. Today, as the threats to the aircraft carrier mount, it is imperative that naval aviation relearn the doctrinal roles that carriers have had in the past so that they are not inadvertently or ignorantly subjected to levels of risk that are not commensurate with their doctrinal use. Simple focus on mission is insufficient and dangerous. I have on the bottom here, eyes of the fleet with a question mark. This leads me to a bit of speculation on the nature of Naval Aviation 5.0. As you can see from this slide, I believe Naval Aviation 5.0 will be substantially unmanned. because unmanned aircraft enjoy significant advantages in range, endurance, and stealth over manned ones. They'll allow the carriers to stand off at greater distances to do their work. Moreover, if, as I believe, future warfare will be missile-centric, I can see a role for carriers in populating a highly dangerous battle space with long-endurance, line-of-sight communications relays to maintain the network, and an array of ISR aircraft to provide targeting information to the subs and ships carrying our new generation of anti-ship and land attack missiles. In a sense, naval aviation will have come full circle. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention. I hope you have a bit better understanding of the institution that we call Naval Aviation. It's been 100 years, 100 hard years, but 100 successful years. I've been proud to be part of it. Stand by for your questions. Thank you. I guess everybody's probably wanting to get home before the weather turns too bad. If so, thank you very much for your attention.